And we are quote unquote live, for anyone in the audience who may be here. I'll defer to Terry.
So good evening. This is the planning board meeting of November 15th. I'm going to begin with a roll call for the planning board. Alden Clark.
Here.
Beth Delisle is not here. Bob Cope.
Here.
Jamie Pennington.
Here.
Heather Rogers.
Here.
Charlie Palmisano.
Here.
Jen Bluestein.
Here.
Brian Dalton.
Here.
And Rick Tainter here. So we have six of our 7 members and both associate members present. Before going into the joint public hearing, I would like to take one item out of order, which is the public hearing for the city of Newburyport at 388 High Street, also known as 447 Merrimack Street, Lower Atkinson Common. There is this is a site plan review application. It's been continued from the September 20th meeting, and there is a request to continue this meeting to the December 6th meeting. Could I have a motion to continue the meeting to December 6th?
Move to continue.
Is there a second?
Second motion.
You're all here, so we do not need to have a roll call. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? It's unanimous. Okay, thank you. Now for the planning board, I will open the joint public hearing on ordinance 164 regarding updating was zoning map amendment and updating the multifamily use definition. I'll turn it over to the chair of the Planning and Development Committee to open your portion of the hearing.
Should I talk super loud because we're going into the hour?
I think it's okay.
Okay. So yeah, welcome everybody. I'm Ed Cameron. I'm the chair of the City Council's Planning and Development Committee. So I'll call our portion of this public hearing to order. I'm joined by Councilor Mark Wright, who's on the committee. I believe Councilor Preston may be remote, but I can't see that right now. But, the director could tell me.
She is coming in as a panelist now.
Okay, great. And this is also posted as a committee of the whole. So we have Councilor Donahue from Ward 2, Council President Shan from Ward 3, Councilor 5, Ward 5, Councilor McFauley, and at-large Councilor Khan. And there's nobody else on remote. I think that's who we have. Correct. Yep.
Okay, Director Report, could you introduce this?
Yes, that's right. If you wouldn't mind, just for a moment, I don't know if you, I think formality to take care of one because we're having an issue with the screen. Our lovely IT is not got up, so I'm just trying to make sure that everybody can see me on the screen first. So I apologize for that.
Okay, I don't really have anything formal to take care of.
Sorry, bear with me for just a moment. It was working fine a second ago, and as usual, it just kind of went out. So, Rick, was there another continuance?
There is, but since I've already opened the hearing, I don't want to close the hearing and go back to that.
We've had 2 of these owls die recently, and I've been advocating for years to try to get better equipment, so I'm not have that happen. So we're kind of looking along. Yeah,
So we all have lots of paper that we can look at related to the item that we're expecting later.
I guess I can take advantage of this pause to acknowledge that we have received, I think, 3 written comments. One from Jared Eigerman, one from Councilor Sharif Seed, and then one that I think may have just come in this afternoon from Novak Nikitich. So. The ones from, no, you're right. The ones from Councilors Need and Jared Eigerman did not go into it. It's just sorry about that.
Oh, yeah. Let's read it.
Yeah. I can actually spend this time, you know.
Okay, then I'll look on here. But yeah, that'd be great.
No, the one from, Councilor Z did go down.
What's
The one from Councilor Z did go down.
I get that.
It was the one from, Novak Nickett that just posted online, we didn't get it as an email. So I need to find, Jared.
I don't see Jared Arden.
Yeah, I know that.
I'm gonna send Jared out.
Okay, sorry for the delay, folks. Feel free to advocate for better equipment in our rooms if you're. So here's, all right, so it's okay with the chairs? So, sorry, my name is Andy Ford. I'm the Director of Planning and Development. I'm only speaking briefly, and some of you know that I talk fast, so I'll try to talk slower. But I'm here to provide a brief overview of what we've discussed tonight with the zoning change. There's a couple of components to it. I'll summarize a couple of salient points to it, and then leave it, if you have questions from there, we can sort of take it from there, obviously, with public comment deliberations. Also with us is Lisa Mead and Scott Brown, who are involved with the development, specifically at the global site, part of which this zoning change directly impacts. So I'll speak a little bit briefly to that, and then they may want you to speak a little bit to the development scheme for the site, which is obviously substantive to what we're discussing this evening. So feel free, to the chairs if you want to interrupt me, but I'll run through this, and then if there are questions, we can sort of take it from there. What we'll see here, just a little bit of context and background. There are two parts to the zoning change that are being discussed here. One is the map change specifically affecting the High Street and State Street properties of the old global gas station site that I think we're all familiar with. The other one is actually an update to the multifamily use definition. They're integrated here in one amendment. It actually came up in part as we were discussing this global site, but the change to the multifamily definition, I'll speak first myself. I think the zoning administrator agrees with me, but we've had some discussion about this. There's benefit, I think, in allowing a change to that definition that not only impacts the ability to do something better at this particular site, but also provides better flexibility for applicants who are submitting to the board, either the ZBA or the planning board, for other sites where there might be multifamily. And so the change to that multifamily definition that allows essentially smaller structures may be preferable for us as a city and not just with respect to the particular site. The purposes, again, just as a summary, one is specifically as it pertains to the global site, just to facilitate the redevelopment. And I use the term viable, meaning something that actually is marketable and complies with zoning for the global site. So that's something that we keep in mind is what's viable under zoning today, what would it take to make something that's viable. I'll speak a little bit to the establishing consistent R3 or residential 3 zoning district at the 4 corners of that intersection that we're at, and I'll have a couple of visuals and maps to show you. And then also, let me just move this block for those of you in the room. Allowing flexibility for, as I said, reduced massing of the structures in a multifamily use, and we'll see that specifically as it pertains to the global site and how that works on this particular potential development. But as you'll see here, I think one of the rationales for changing that definition or providing an update to it is the current definition actually mandates not only that applicants come to the city's boards with a singular structure, depending no matter how many units are in that multifamily, but also prohibits the boards themselves essentially from approving or allowing something that has smaller structures that might actually effectively reduce the massing or the appeared massing to the neighborhood, to the abutters and so forth. So there's benefit, I think, in allowing some flexibility there in having smaller, two smaller structures, let's say, rather than one large one. So with respect to the global site itself, this is just a snapshot of the site most of us are familiar with, but you kind of get an idea. This site doesn't really fit, if you will, with the High Street corner, either the use that was there or the aesthetics of it. And it's both the corridor of High Street, the overall neighborhood, and what we refer to as a streetscape appearance. These two images here, this one and the following one, are both just illustrate a little bit of what we more typically have along the High Street corridor, at least in close proximity. The High Street zoning, which I'll speak to in a minute, was established in large part to try to protect some of the larger estate properties from being subdivided, broken down, and changed in their character. And I'll speak to that a little bit in part because we're talking about changing the High Street designation for this particular parcel or 2 parcels together into a R3 zoning like the other 3 corners for the intersection. So some of the context here, again, I'm not going over everything and I realize that. So if there are questions, let me know. I'm not intending to go over all the background that folks may already know, or you don't necessarily need to get in the weeds about. But there was a determination, essentially a blight, without using a sort of a simplified term, that the derelict gas station, nothing was happening with it, the landowner wasn't doing anything with it, and there wasn't any near-term plan to do anything with it. So there was some concern expressed about essentially the concept of blight at that location and its impact on the city and the neighborhood. It's a very prominent location coming out of the downtown, so clearly has some impact there. And that was raised as a concern by the city council. The landowner, Global, was brought in, had some discussions with the city council, and agreed to essentially go back and remove what I'm listed as item 3, which is removal of a deed restriction that Exxon had placed on the property. This is not atypical of gas stations or those who operate gas stations, but a deed restriction that would prevent residential uses from being on the site because they were concerned about future liability. Should there be any contaminants and whatnot. Oil spills and things like that are not necessarily, or gas spills are not necessarily uncommon. So that was a typical kind of boilerplate things you might see the attorneys wanting to put in deeds to make sure they protected themselves liability years down the road. For anything sort of a clawback, for future issues that arises. So there were a couple of things that were going on here. There are two things that are sort of inconsistent with the path that I say the city, meaning multiple city officials have talked about, particularly in the city council's context. We've all, quote unquote, talked about changing the development of this site from the old gas station, which is actually an abandoned use, no longer viable as a use, to residential use. And in order to get there, there are two things that were encumbrances or problems in getting there. One was the Exxon deed restriction. It was actually inconsistent with the zoning that called for residential only, really. And then there was also the deed restriction was permitting that use, but also the zoning itself has some constraints, which I'll go into item 4. I do want to just pause on my bullet number 2, which is that, like I said, the commercial use of that gas station was abandoned. It's been over 2 years, abandoned. Residential zoning was in place, and use variances in the city are prohibited. So it's not like the landowner can come into the zoning board of appeals and ask for a variance to have a different use at that location, like a gas station or commercial use like that. Number 4, this is some of the stuff that's relevant to the zoning and why it may make sense to change the zoning designation here. The property itself today, and I have some visuals to show the whole property and the map, the zoning maps that relate to it, but it basically has 1/3 of the area that would be required just for a single family home. And that's kind of suggests right there that the zoning may not necessarily be comparable to what is necessary to have what we want. It got swept up in that larger high street residential zoning district change, but it's not necessarily like our larger parcels that were the intention, I think, of that zoning district was intended to protect these larger estate properties, whereas this one is actually a relatively small property at the corner. And so there are a few others that are sort of at the corners of streets along the high street corridor, and there might be some debate about whether those are still in the same character of those larger high street estates. And here we can see it presents some potential problems for having a viable residential development. So it's a smaller corner lot, like I said, with about 20,000 square feet, a little over maybe. But effectively it would require a pretty substantial variance in area, never mind other dimensional requirements, which I'm sure the landowner reps can speak to, but just land area alone, pretty substantial variance, I would say, for the zoning board of appeals to be asked to grant a variance of that difference, 20,000 square feet down from a 60,000 square foot requirement, just to have one single family home in that district. And that's not criticism of the district. It's just to say that on this particular lot, it clearly indicates that you wouldn't really have a viable use unless you were petitioned the ZBA, the zoning board of appeals, for a pretty substantial portion of relief, something disproportionate, I would say, than the sort of normal ratio that they might look at. It was another thing that's interesting to note about this, and I'll speak to it with some visuals, is this parcel was actually R3 or zoned R3 prior to two changes that happened in recent time, one of which was the High Street residential zoning. Like I said, there are two sub-districts of the High Street district. One is A and one is B. The one that we're talking about here happens to be the A district on the east side of the city, but our High Street corridor. But that High Street change happened in 2017, and the down zoning of the R3 district happened in 2018. And what we'll see here in these subsequent slides is just the effect there, where effectively what we're talking about now is reverting it back to the R3 designation. And in terms of map change, the R3 designation that it had before those two things happened in relatively recent years. So this is, I realize you can't see all the scale of this, and we can zoom in or take a greater look at data detail if folks want. But this is the zoning map of the city prior to those changes happening, prior to the R3 down zoning to an R2. What I'm noting here, I think is worthwhile just to note on this map is, what you see is this darker sort of, I want to say orange maybe color, here and here and here, extending out of the downtown. That was the R3 district at that time. You'll also notice that there's a relatively continuous, all that sort of pink or orange color here. Along High Street, there's no High Street special district that's been created here just yet along this corridor. So that's prior to those two changes. After those two changes in 17 and 18, we see here, what you'll notice is the larger R3 has been reduced in size and is now, it's a little bit harder to see, but I have a globe of this, but it's right down here close to the downtown. So there's a relatively small R3 district that's left after from what was originally R3. Also, you'll notice that there's this darker green right in here and this blue color, and those are the two High Street sub-districts. So the High Street B and High Street A, and it's the High Street A at this corner that we're looking at, and I'll do a blow up of that. So those are the two notable map changes or zoning district changes that have actually, in essence, what we're talking about here is reverting back for this particular piece of land. Map change back to R3, which is what it was some years ago. This is just a blow up of three maps for comparison purposes, to maybe help a little bit more. What you're seeing here in the circle is the location of the lot in question. So that's the global site right at the corner. This is High Street right here, and all three maps, they're essentially the same layout. So slight different appearance of the colors, but they're basically the same thing. What you're seeing is High Street, you're seeing State Street, and you're seeing the downtown in this area here, the waterfront, that's the waterfront right there with the central pavement. That's Route 1. So what you're seeing here on this far left map is before the residential 3 down zoning to R2, and before the High Street residential A was adopted, which would be in this area right in here. That's the blue that we're seeing on the second graphic. That's what it looked like beforehand. All 4 corners of this intersection extending out were R3 residential district. After that, those 2 changes happened. We saw that this corner was effectively a High Street designation along with the land over here. And you see the R3 has also been reduced. You can see it doesn't quite extend over here the way it did previously. The orange colors changed slightly in these 2 graphics, but it's the same district we're talking about. And then in this graphic here, what you'll notice is this is what's being proposed here essentially is just that tiny little, if you will, parcel on the zoning map, reverting back to the R3 that it was at the other 3 corners are today. At that corner. So it isn't necessarily even a change from something we had before. It's actually reverting back to something as opposed to something entirely new per se. A couple of things to note, and there was a communication, I think it was noted earlier, there's some communication that we got. It sounded like not everybody's received it, so I think I'll send out tomorrow morning that communication, but to make sure everybody on the council and the planning board has seen it. Councilor Argument, former Councilor Argument had commented on a couple of things, one of which I just wanted to make sure there's clear understanding of a few things. Wasn't sure if 100% of the things that they were clarified. So one thing is multifamily use is not something that's as of right, anywhere. So multifamily uses are all by special permit, and I say discretionary, meaning the board has to decide that the use is appropriate at that location as part of that special permit. Granted, there's, typical things to evaluate, there's case law and things like that, but in essence, the board itself has a fair amount of latitude to determine whether something is reasonable at its location as part of the local permitting process. That typically happens after the zoning is in place. Here, what we're talking about, and this is a little bit more complicated at this location in terms of the map change and as it pertains to this particular site, is unique in the sense that we're now upfronting a lot of detail about what might happen at this site down the road, partly because before making a map change to the zoning district, we're actually interested in nailing down some of those details. And so that's where a so-called development agreement comes into play. And I'll speak to that in a few minutes. But even after, a development agreement is in place, and I'll speak to what's in there, and even after the zoning, were to take place, as a map change, the applicant would still need to come in for permitting before the zoning board of appeals for a discretionary special permit to allow the multifamily use at the location. And that allows all aspects of the project to be considered, in this case, by the zoning board of appeals. They're the board that will review that. They can review it, they can do peer review, which means they can hire consultants to look at various aspects of the project, whether it be stormwater, traffic, things like that, if there are any concerns. That's something that they, just like the planning board, can do as needed. They don't need any special legislation beyond what the state has already provided. I also would note that other than the districts that I've listed here, multifamily is prohibited in other districts, and excluding the 4-yard district, I should say. That's a special district where, both the city and the state were essentially, allowing as of right multifamily, subject to various different design standards and a plan review by the planning board. But that's a special district down by the train station. These other districts in which multifamily is allowed are somewhat limited, actually, if you look at the map, and I can flip back to the map, but they're limited in area and scope, and that's one thing I think to keep in mind here as well, as we talk about changing the definition of multifamily and where the implications might be. That was something I think that Councilor Deed had commented on earlier today, in an email communication, to some of the planning board members. The locations in which this multifamily is allowed is actually relatively limited as well, just something to keep in mind. That's the R3, so residential B district we're talking about, the B1 and B1 district being sort of the Story Avenue area down by the traffic circle, Route 1 traffic circle. The B2 and the B3 essentially being our downtown. And then the I2, which I'll point out in a second, is a special industrial district, where there's sort of contemplation of a longer term adjustment. You know, you think about the immersion site on Merrimack Street. And then we have the waterfront marine dependent and waterfront mixed use district, which is essentially along our waterfront. So those are some limited areas if you actually look at the areas that are available, and also keep in mind that some of these areas are largely built out, have historic buildings and other regulations in place that might preclude demolition of things that are there and so forth. So the implications or the potential for, you know, widespread use of something that's sort of outlandish is somewhat managed, I would say, in part because of that. So like I said, the ZBA would review the use of multifamily. I would also note here that the planning board has site plan review when a project has 5 or more units. So here in the context of this particular site and the global site and then what's being contemplated for this site, I would say that's not actually a trigger here, because what's being contemplated is actually 4 units. It's below that threshold. And I think that's a relatively decent threshold, you know, more appropriate for the site than something higher. But if it was a 5-unit project and in a multifamily category, that would also require the planning board to review it in addition to the zoning board of appeals for the use itself. I'm not necessarily convinced, I'll just speak for myself, I'm not necessarily convinced that a site plan review creates additional, you know, substantial benefit to the process, so to speak, or leverage to get a better result per se, given that the special permit itself through the ZBA is a discretionary permit, and they have a fair amount of latitude with that, I would say, in some ways more than this site plan review process itself. So this is that zoning map, and like I said, the areas that multifamily is allowed are essentially the downtown. Right in here, that's our B2 and B3 are these red areas. We have the B1, which is the Story Avenue and the traffic circle. And then we have our waterfront mixed use, which is right along the waterfront there, that's that blue you're seeing. And then this light green that travels across the edge of the Merrimack here a little bit on the frontage of the down on the water side, that's the waterfront marine dependent district. So those are areas where it'll be allowed. If you have looked at the maps like I have and sort of zoom in on them and see what's there, you recognize in the downtown, there's not a whole lot of room to sort of demolish historic buildings and place a bunch of multifamily buildings and whatnot. So there's somewhat limited scope or availability to do certain things. That being said, a couple of other things to note. The question that was also raised in the comment today, potential non-residential uses are allowed. The category I think that might be of particular concern, and I would certainly say for myself as a land use planner, is I don't think it would be appropriate for essentially traffic generating uses to happen at this given site. That's probably due to the intersection we have there at High Street and the close proximity of driveways that might be there, for instance. So when we think about the fact that retail trade or retail services might be allowed in the R3 district, you know, as they are already, that's by discretionary special permit only. And I certainly, if I was commenting to the zoning board of appeals on some application in which someone is proposing a commercial use like a retail trade or retail services, I would be advocating against allowing that use or suggest that's an inappropriate use. And partly because of 2 of the findings that the zoning board of appeals would have to make. The first one, number 3 of their list, being that there's, you know, not creating undue traffic congestion. I think that I put emphasis on that. I think that would be an inappropriate location to have traffic generating uses. We wouldn't necessarily want to have a gas station reopen there again, for instance. And I'll speak only myself as opposed to other members here. The other thing is whether or not it's impairing the character and integrity of the district or the adjoining districts, like the High Street next door, the surrounding R3 district that is near. So those are the things to keep in mind, I guess, is where it was pointed out that yes, there are some other things that are allowed in that R3 district by discretionary special permit. However, I find it highly unlikely, and for good reason, that we would not want to allow a traffic generating use that's, you know, a non-residential one at that location. This is just a schematic plan, and we'll speak a little bit further, but this is the schematic plan for development of the site. This is referenced in a development agreement that was recently, it was finalized earlier this week, distributed, and I will speak to that a little bit further in more detail, but in essence, what's being proposed here for this particular site, this is the gas station site. What you're seeing here is High Street and State Street. And as we know, there's a long curb cut across the whole frontage here on both streets here, largely. And what's being proposed here is essentially reducing all of that to one curb cut off of State Street. 4 units that are in 2 structures, 3 of the units being in the primary structure towards the street, a 4th unit being in a secondary or carriage house style structure that you might see typical of, you know, some of the patterns of land use along High Street corridor. Part of the idea here was to break down that massing. So rather than with the typical definition of multifamily, having the developer be forced to, or having our board be forced to approve a project that has one larger building here, to allow a portion of that structure to be broken off into a separate piece that allows there to be 2 smaller massings. So that's where, for one reason, I think it's good to allow some flexibility on whether or not we forcibly make people do much larger structures rather than looking at the possibility through that discretionary review, which is still subject to the board's approval, multiple structures that would break down that massing. And that's effectively what is being attempted here, to break down that massing. All the parking is kept on site. There's some obviously outdoor spaces, patio space and whatnot. There might be further, you know, adjustments to some things addressing, you know, some other concerns during local permitting, but for the most part, as far as I can tell, there's been a fair amount of work with meeting with the butters to work through some issues on buffering, landscaping, setbacks, you know, things like that. And then we can talk a little bit more of that. But in essence, what's proposed here is replacing the gas station structure, be demolished, gas station sign goes away. Abandoned use is taken away, and if the zoning change passes, the development agreement, is in place, of the contract essentially, and we require adherence to this particular plan that we're looking at, you know, with a few variations of it to look at, but effectively we know where the buildings are going to be, we know how many units are going to be there, we know there's only one driveway curb cut, you know, et cetera. So just in essence, that is what's being proposed here for this site. This is a graphic that was provided by the team working on the project, just to show a little bit of the massing. We could do a similar graphic out of our GIS or mapping software, but it shows some of the massing of the structures in the area. So you see here the gas station site and the proposed structure, the primary structure and the secondary structure in lieu of the gas station building, which is right about here. And what you'll notice is that you know, you have some debate about whether or not this massing is appropriate. The structure is not, you know, dissimilar per se to ones that are surrounding neighborhood. The more important piece, I would say, other than sort of a bird's eye view, which most people do not actually see buildings by the bird's eye view. They actually see them at ground level. So one, in addition to sort of, you know, considering the bird's eye view and how that compares to footprints of other buildings, I would actually say even more important than that is the fact that the facade or streetscape length of a building here on High Street or State Street is comparable to what we're seeing sort of across the street there. These are not, you know, atypical frontages that the pedestrian is going to see at ground level as they're looking up at a structure or the length of it. And that's something to consider there. You know, for instance, if we were to have a 4th unit that's added in there in a larger structure, that structure would be longer length along State Street. And one might question whether it might be better to break down that massing. And that's one of the reasons why we talk about amending the multifamily definition to allow at least the board to approve a plan that has multiple structures to break down the massing. And so that gives some context for the scale and massing of what's being proposed at this site in that location. Just a couple of photographs, visuals of what that, you know, site looks like today, and then what we see across the street. So this is more akin, I would say, to what's being proposed here today. A residential structure, a primary one, you'd see essentially a carriage house style structure behind it. But this is the opposite side of State Street. So as we flip back and forth, you can see sort of transitioning that side of the street to look more akin to what's happening on the opposite side of State Street. So the development agreement itself, this is essentially a preemptive contract. It's basically to establish some baseline terms as a sort of belt and suspenders. It's a little bit more detailed than when we get up front prior to having zoning in place for something, and then seeing someone apply to a local board like the ZBA or the planning board for local permits. That would still be necessary for this development, even with the zoning change here. There'd still need to be an application to the zoning board of appeals, notice to abutters, a public hearing, review of the plans involved. But this development agreement is intended to at least define a smaller box for what could happen there and make sure it's reasonably within, you know, within the confines of what something is reasonably appropriate for that area before we even contemplate, you know, the zoning change. And I will speak for just myself, that I feel reasonably confident and comfortable that the development agreement, with the zoning change we're talking about here, would allow us to get to an appropriate, form of development at this site, and obviously I wouldn't be spending the time here myself if I didn't think we were sort of in that place. So some of the key elements that are included in there are a maximum number of 4 units, for the overall development, no more than that. We had someone who came in with us, some earlier time frame when the global folks were looking for interested buyers. Someone who said, can I put up 6 units? And then I said, I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think it's gonna go very far. You can come back, go up, but they didn't come back. And as you can see here, we have something that I think is a little bit more appropriate in terms of scale. At least I'll say, 4 units is a little bit more appropriate in scale. The main structure of 3 units, secondary with 1, I would say it's akin to what we consider sort of contextually appropriate carriage house style secondary structure. Something that has an agreed upon building locations, that's, per this concept plan we just looked at, it's incorporated by reference. There has to be substantial adherence to that plan going forward, when applications are made to the board for permitting after a zoning change is made. Agreeing upon only having 1 driveway curb cut, I felt, I'll just speak for myself, I thought it was important not to have a curb cut on the High Street. It would have been a relatively short distance to the intersection with State Street anyway. So I think it's preferable, the plan that you have here, where there's only 1 off of State Street. And there's a fair amount of attempts here in the plan to provide, substantial buffer and screening to abutting properties. So they've worked, and I think it speaks for themselves, but they've worked to try to pull the building as far as they can away from abutting properties, recognizing the sort of, matching setbacks and streetscape that you typically want, looking at adjacent buildings. Also speaks to compatible architectural styles. So it notes that there would be a sort of a Victorian era architectural style to the structure itself. And then they also had made an offer, commitment to $25,000 to be put towards pedestrian signal upgrades at the intersection. I'll put a footnote in the brackets here to that, as we know from the local permitting process, typically we would expect here new sidewalks, given the frontage there and the long driveway curb cuts, we would expect new sidewalks on the frontage and accessible ramps, as part of that work there. Those have to be, accessible crossings, so that we expect that work, typical sidewalk work, that's triggered already by our ordinances during permitting. But they've offered to provide some funding towards the signalization or improvement of that intersection, where we know there's some upgrades needed to the controls for the pedestrian control there. We have put forward for discussion this evening, after the ordinance amendment was sponsored. I had some further discussion with our planning board chair, and we had some further discussion about the relationship between the multifamily definition and what's contemplated here, and 2 other areas of zoning. One is site review, and at what threshold does the planning board have a role in reviewing a project like this or some larger scale? As I mentioned earlier, the planning board has a project that's 5 or more units. This project is 4. So it's not reaching that 5 threshold where a site plan review is necessary. We also discussed the relationship to 6C, what we call section 6C, which is a provision that, when I got here, was dealing with multiple residential structures on a lot. It was changed relatively recently, and then the chair was one of the authors of the amendments that were made to it, but was reduced to focus more on single and family homes as a potential area to have those multiple structures in. Because it was narrowed to sort of focus on that area, what was suggested is essentially the revised language that you see in yellow here, and I would certainly defer to Rick's chair if he wants to speak further. But the intent here was to basically make it clear that you wouldn't really have a path, for instance, in this location for more than the type of approval you'd be able to get from the planning board under 6C. So here, in effect, what happens is the planning board has a role in reviewing a project beyond, the scope that we're looking at here for this global site, by example. So the second piece of that provision was broken out for a second sentence, just to kind of keep it easier to read. But the additional language is just to note that to have that multifamily use, the original amendment that was put in to the council packet notes that you can have 1 or more buildings or structures that have 3 more dwelling units. However, one of those structures has to contain 3 more units. So you're setting kind of a baseline for the composition that can happen there. And again, I'll defer to the chair if he wants to speak about it a little further, but that was intended to make sure that we consider the role of the planning board, triggers for other types of review that might be appropriate. Last thing I guess I would speak to here, and again, there might be obviously further questions, is just next steps and timeline for what we would call meaningful results, meaning when we think about city capital projects, we think of shovel-ready projects. In order to get to the gas station building coming down, the residential home being put in place, and the gas station sign coming down, for instance, what is contemplated here is with the development agreement, which is now in place to lock in some of the baseline details and provide an extra belt and suspenders level of protection for the city and for the abutters. With then the zoning amendment adopted by the council, and I would suggest the as amended version that we're discussing this evening, that was included as an attachment to the development agreement. And with the after that, a subsequent special permit application and hearing before the ZBA, which includes the butter input, then we could see potentially in the spring, the actual work done to change the character of that property from a derelict gas station to the residential use that's being proposed here now. That's just a brief sort of, that's like sort of glossing the surface of, some of the context here, but from my lens, that covers most of the ground that is, sort of 7 points here, but there might be other areas that I didn't cover and folks that might have questions about. And this is just meant to have sort of at least a baseline understanding, most people have at least an understanding of what's going on here, what are the relevant, components or pieces of this, and the details or documents or mechanics that are involved. So if I miss anything, please let me know.
So I think, we obviously don't want to start discussion of the substance of this until we've heard from the public, but I think that it's an appropriate time now for, if there are any questions from councilors or planning board members, just for clarification, if you didn't understand anything. We're here, but again, not to get into discussion of the substance, but just clarification of this one.
And actually, sorry, I thank you, Jay. If I could, just one of the things we need to note very clearly, although I was referencing on the maps, is there was a suggestion also, and this has come up with other zoning amendments before, it's not always characterized correctly, but I would not characterize this as a quote unquote spot zoning, as that term is sometimes used. Spot zoning is really taking place where you have a change to a zoning district to an area, and you have a proposed change to something that is basically there's no differentiation from the surrounding area in any way. There's no public purpose associated with making that change. And the reason I'm sorry, I forgot to mention it, but part of the reason for that is if you look at these maps here, you'll notice, first of all, there's a actual legitimate purpose for making the change, which is actually that this is a viable residential development. You actually can't do a residential development without a substantial variance or variances, I would say. Under the current high street zoning, it's not possible without a bunch of variances to even have one home. With that in mind, in order the idea of being we have a public purpose in changing the character of that site from a derelict gas station to residential use. We also have as context the fact that these three corners of that intersection aren't R3 today, and the whole intersection was R3 historically. So there's nothing sort of, it's not in an isolated area by itself. It's actually with full continuity to the surrounding intersection that this property would be returned essentially to an R3 district like the other three corners. So just to dispel the rumor, the idea that some of this might be spot zoning, just throwing out the term doesn't mean it's spot zoning. There has to be no legitimate public purpose for doing it and no differentiation for surrounding properties. This property is somewhat different from the larger estate properties that I think the high street zoning was originally sort of focused on preserving. The character is relatively small in scale. So sorry.
So are there any questions for Andy before we open it up to public comment? Yes, Councilman Bowman.
Yeah, so if you wouldn't mind going back to slide 9 and the map that you showed, right? So I get before and after, there's a couple of things here, right? So it could be argued that this property the underlying zoning was R3 anyway, right? And the abandonment of the commercial use just reverts it back to R3, right? And so I think there's an argument to be made.
Not that it reverts back to a different zoning district, but that it can't be commercial, right? Is it? Yes,
Can't be commercial.
Yeah.
So, okay, so that was just the point. The question I have really centers around, what you've shown here is obviously the parcel in question, right? In the context of what's greater. My line of questioning here is focused around the unintended consequences of R3 and the other areas that would be impacted by this. I would agree with the statement that says, it's probably in our better interest to pursue something different on this corner again. But what I'm more concerned about is the generalization of zoning within the R3 itself. And I'm unsure if we've looked at it, is the potential unintended consequences of the impact on R3 in general. I know it's smaller, I know it's concentrated, but in many ways, you know, we had that situation not too long ago, which was a loophole where we had multiple buildings on a lot, and yet they were connected by like a roof. And, you know, we closed that loophole, right? Are we opening up the loophole again? And although one site, you know, one building would have to have 3 or more buildings, we are basically reverting back to that. And so that's my question is, have we looked at the unintended consequences of the impact of this particular zoning language on the rest of the R3?
Yeah, and like I said, you know, given the limited areas of impact that would be allowed in, obviously with the discretionary, recognize the discretionary review, and if you look at, for instance, with this visually here, you can almost make out, you know, given the types of structures, for instance, in the downtown, where multifamily is allowed with the R3, with the downtown district, for instance, there's a fair amount of structures that are there, so the idea that someone's gonna be able to squeeze in a bunch of, you know, several multifamily structures, you know, multifamily use of multiple structures is gonna be pretty difficult for them to do in an area like this. For instance, if we go along the coastline, we kind of look at a similar kind of analysis, but I certainly would defer to planning board members and the sheriff, if they want to speak to what they think, whether that's an impact or not. But my sense is that there's not a significant, you know, unintended consequence that that we need to be concerned about. And I'm always open, of course, to, you know, continue discussion of that nature, but it would be of concern to the Office of Planning and Development, and to obviously the board and city council. If we thought that was the case, it's a fair discussion and concern to have. I'm not necessarily inclined to feel that that's something that we have a problem here. But again, it's a fair discussion to have if someone has a different thought on that, to go very further on that.
I have a clarifying question. So the language, the original language here, in the list of allowable uses, by the family and hopefully, would be changing one or more buildings, blah, 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 on the same lot. This is technically 2 lots, right?
Yeah. They're commonly owned, so they're joined now.
Okay. So the way it's one lot, it's not.
This would be treated as one lot for permitting. Yeah, okay.
I think that falls under the doctrine of merger, so it's
Yeah.
kind of hard to untether that. Almost.
I was thinking about the doctrine of merger.
Yeah, I thought so.
Duly noted.
Any other questions for, yes, Councilor John?
Yeah, thank you very much. So just to kind of condense a little bit of what we're talking about, the main change to R3 is the definition, the multifamily definition that we're allowing. And nothing else in terms of special permit, all the other things are still there. So in spite of, you know, going back to the unintended consequences, special permit is still a requirement across all those districts where this definition is going to be applied.
Correct, and then that's why I felt it was important to know that earlier, is because even aside from any particular concerns, you know, folks might have, you know, all of us might have, I care about urban design, I care about the quality of development. But knowing that it's a discretionary review also provides me, for instance, a greater level of confidence and, you know, sense that the city has protection, because we have boards that review these things. There's a fair amount of public input that is, you know, abutters are notified. There's a review process that public hearing that is had. Sometimes those are continued for several nights. There's a review of what's happening. But that is discretionary. It's not automatic that someone has not keyed in the table permitted as of right. It's actually a discretionary permit. That's not to say that, you know, I think they would necessarily be able to get approval, but it's not an as of right. It's very different than that. It's something that has to be, they have to present themselves to the board as a project that's reasonable and appropriate for the site, and the board has to make typical findings that it's appropriate for the site, you know, essentially for that.
And to add to that, so this definition, is it applied in other communities? And the one area that I have a question on how it's stated, and I don't know if we're getting into the content, or I should ask the chairs, is this more opening up across the board, or are we focusing only on the presentation?
I think you go a little further here, because.
Okay, so in terms of the, and I'll read it here, and where there is more than one unit in a building, either common floor ceiling assemblies between the dwelling units or common wall connectors if you could just explain, because in this, the rendering that we looked at, there's a single structure that has multiple with the kind of common area walls, and then one that's the carriage house. So can you explain, when we are breaking things up, does that mean that from that definition, I thought even the carriage house would not really qualify? So
No, actually, so, what that's getting at is, and Councilor McCauley had spoken to this, earlier, was, there was a change that was made. I think it was a project on Lime Street that might have triggered this, originally going back some years, but, here we go. This plan is compliant with that mainly because we have this long continuation of these units being connected. If someone were to basically, to Councilor McCauley's point about, that where things kind of went awry, where people are basically taking a secondary structure like this and then putting some kind of really narrow,
Riesling.
we might have seen something closer, like narrow breezeway between them and then saying, well, that's one structure, but they're effectively sort of sneaking around it, that's the kind of thing that provision that's already in the text of the ordinance was intended to prevent and make it really a true, massing or one structure itself, as opposed to someone attempting to have two separate things that kind of, just to qualify itself as a use, put this little symbolic and, physical connection between them. And that provision is not changing, that stays in here. It's just been broken out as a separate sentence just to make it a little easier to read that definition.
And then my last question, it's on the developers agreement.
Yeah.
Are we ready to move to that? And I'll then pause, but I think on the rendering that you were just at, question on this, is this just a suggested, or is this pretty, the one thing I was just wondering about the unit in the middle, like its entrance way, and it's just, I don't know if this was just a rendering that was more crudely done, because I just didn't see how unit 2 was the entry point, unless I'm missing something. So that's all I just had a question.
Yeah, there could be flexibility for the entrance to the unit itself, to your point. There could be flexibility for the entrance that's created for that unit. But the footprint, the location of this building, essentially, its proximity to the lot lines, to proximity to the streetscape and so forth, that's basically fixed in by this plan. So you have some ability to maybe shift, laterally along here if you need to, but you can't, move this building any closer to those lot lines, essentially. This was not intended to get down to that fine grain level of detail that the ZBA would typically be looking at, and our architect needs more time to develop. In that fine grain detail, typically you're not investing in a set of detailed plans like that unless you got something that's, in the right direction. And I don't know that we necessarily just speak to in this development agreement, the specific location of the door per se. But to your point, this does not preclude the ability to have that flexibility and make sure that it has a proper entrance, for instance, and provide some flexibility on that end. There was some, obviously contemplation of some private space for, the residential units and where those might be with, buffering for the residential abutting properties. But I think that is also contemplated here, the fact that each of these has to have, proper entrances and exits, and then there might need to be some flexibility on that front as they come in permanent.
And then questions were emailed. We're gonna walk through those and get some answers. So I'll yield then.
Sure, I don't know, if the things that I haven't already addressed with you or.
No, the ones that came in, like there was some, kind of questions sent in from the abutters, and I didn't know if we were gonna go with those.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah, I haven't.
I would think that'd be a little after public
Sure, yeah.
comment,
Okay,
because we're gonna, that might take a while.
okay, thank you.
Okay, if there are no other questions,
I think there's a question.
I don't have a question, but wonder if I may offer a point of fact regarding the zoning ordinance. I don't know if that's permitted.
why don't we do that during the discussion,
Okay.
following discussion? Leave it open to public comment at this point.
And through the chairs, I apologize, I forgot to note, with Lisa and Scott here representing the potential local developer, obviously who has a global, and obviously if things pan out, this is, what we see here. They also could speak more to the development scheme as opposed to the site, questions along those lines there, so I'll defer the chairs on that piece, but I don't have any problem myself, but they could speak to that aspect of it here a little further, even then, obviously, I have people spoken here. Not another presentation per se, but just, some points that we could make or clarifications they could make.
Point before we did.
I think there's probably a few things I'd like to speak to now, but I'll defer to you as chair if you're okay with that.
That's probably better than now.
Yeah.
Thank you, chairs, and members of the board and committee. Lisa Mead, lead teller and cost of 30 Green Street in the report. And Scott and I represent River City Development LLC. And I just wanted to kind of give you some context, and then Scott's actually going to talk about how this plan was developed with working with the neighbors on this concept plan, and what his intentions are, and what, if this goes forward, what the zoning board is likely to see moving forward. So in a context point of view, over the last year since Global put this up for sale, I would say between 6 and 8 people have approached me, and similarly Scott, about potential development on this property. And it is very limited in the current zoning that it is, mostly given what Andy has indicated. In the HSRA district, you can do a single family by right and a 2-family by special permit, right? It requires 60,000 square feet of area. This lot has 22,623 square feet. It requires 100 feet of frontage. What you have to remember is this has 2 areas of frontage. We have 2 front yards here. We have State Street and we have High Street. Since State Street is the longest frontage, the rear yard is that which is opposite State Street. The rear yard setback under the HSRA zoning is 300 feet. The front yard setback, and so there are 2, is 75 feet. So 75 feet from High Street is approximately to the High Street side of that building that exists there today. Okay, just to give you an idea. So because of that, it would not be pre-existing non-conforming. You would have to meet that side yard setback. You could take advantage of the established front yard setback on State Street, because that is the main front yard. So you could use that as the established front yard setback and technically move a structure closer to State Street. But you're further limited because the required minimum open space in the HSRA is 85%. The required maximum lot coverage is 12%. All right, so think about that. So while in some of these calculations, like the open space, you have some non-conformities because of the existing coverage of a hot top on the lot. You don't with regard to lot coverage, which is essentially everything under a roof, which leaves you 12% to 2,700 square feet for a footprint, anything under a roof. And then you have to think about what Global wants people to pay for this property, and the fact that you may not put a basement on any structure in this property. That's going to be a deed restriction, no basement. So those are the challenges facing this. You can't use commercial if that's gone. The lots have merged. So it's one lot. So you have to think of something else that you can do with the property. And that's why there's so many people that have walked away, because a lot of people don't have the stamina or the finances, frankly, to go through this process and take the risk to spend the money that we've come so far now that you may not get a zoning change. But nothing really is going to happen here until there's some kind of zoning change. I also want to just point out in the R3, for those who are worried about where else a multifamily might go, the lot requirements and frontage requirements for family, a multifamily housing is 20,000 square feet with 120 feet of frontage. All right. So aside from this lot, there's not many others, as Andy pointed out, in the R3 district, if any. They're all going to be non-conforming. So not only are you going to have to get a special permit for use, you're going to have to get a special permit for non-conformities. So those are the challenges that we went through, but understanding the sensitivity around this lot and the prominence in the city for obvious reasons. That's why the development agreement is really important. So everybody is comfortable with what is going to happen on this property. And that's where I'm going to turn over to Scott, because he can tell you how he's come up with the plan he's come up with.
Great, thank you, Attorney Mead. So the project team has worked extraordinarily hard to get to this point. We've, looked at 10, no less than 10 different design site plan options before we, arrived at this plan before you tonight. And it has been an extraordinarily difficult design project. And one of the things that has made this so difficult are the site constraints, and Lisa just spoke to some of them. One, we have some extraordinarily challenging grades here, from the lowest point on High Street to the point where we're proposing to come in with our driveway, which is at the existing curb cut to the mobile station. There was 6 feet of grade change. There are points at the site that are actually 10 feet higher, higher than that. Lisa also mentioned that we will be subject to a deed restriction here. So one of those conditions of the deed restriction is that we're not allowed to have any living space, storage space, mechanical space, or parking for vehicles below grade. So that means that this structure needs to be elevated to sort of the highest point. So that has been very challenging to work around, and it has actually squashed sort of a number of design opportunities and certainly limited us from digging this thing into the side of the hill. The other thing that's been challenging here, and we did mention this, this is a corner lot. It's a slightly non-orthogonal shape. It doesn't look like much on that plan, but it's caused us a number of design headaches, particularly with some of these other constraints that we're dealing with. And, if the zoning change for this happens, we'll be subject to, 20-foot, since it is a corner lot, 20-foot front yard setbacks in both high and state. Primary lot line will be considered State Street, so that means the rear yard, as you're looking at this property from High Street, will be on the left. So we'll need to be 20 feet away from that common lot line there, further constraining this project. So we've met with the abutters multiple times, and I've considered them part of my design team. They've had a profound influence on this plan before you tonight, and without their input and suggestions, we might be proposing something that's entirely different. In their beginning, it was their suggestion to pursue this sort of two building concept. We understood that with the zoning that currently is, that we would not be allowed to do this. There was also a strong desire to push this building away from towards State Street, away from the lot line with the immediate abutter at 93 High Street. And there was a strong desire to preserve what some consider to be the natural ridge there. And so we pulled this away from that common lot line, and the project has only been improved, because of that. You'll probably hear some comments and questions about retaining walls and grading tonight. This plan has quite a few retaining walls in it. They are an essential architectural and landscape feature of this project. We have a first floor that is going to be, due to the extreme grading on site, we have a first floor that is going to be 7 to 9 feet above that lowest elevation on High Street. And, simply without those retaining walls, I don't know how to address that sort of grade change in a very elegant manner. There is precedent for that. We saw an earlier slide in Andy Fort's presentation of the building that's directly across from this at 1 Pond Street. For those that have been here, for those of you that have been here for a while, this is the former sort of Knights of Columbus, which has a retaining wall. And, that retaining wall goes from 2 feet at its lowest point to 4 feet at that corner. So our retaining walls will not be, or no higher than this. And they're similar to this with one major difference, and that is that none of them are right on the sidewalk, like at this property. And, if you go up Pond Street, there are a lot of those sort of older Victorians there that have some of the similar grading changes that we're dealing with, on this property. You'll also, relative to the grading, I did, there's some, some challenges. This plan represents sort of like, taking that first floor at the highest point of the site. The other thing that you might hear about tonight is some comments about building height. There was an earlier plan here showing sort of like the context of this footprint relative to the neighborhood. There's a lot of data on that plan. And one of the things that we have on that plan is the proposed height of this peak height relative to the abutting structures. We had a surveyor go through and, shoot the height of some of the abutting structures, and we compared it to what we're proposing here. And this is roughly, kind of 4 to 6 feet lower than some of those abutting structures. And in order to figure that, determine that, one of the things that I had to do, and again, this is very, very early on, there's a lot of work that has to happen here in order to bring this project along, but we had to do sort of a conceptual site section. So in order to arrive at that height data, I had to make some assumptions on floor-to-floor heights, ceiling heights, and I measured that height from mean natural grade, not the proposed grade. And that's not how we, here in Newburyport, we measure from the zoning ordinance says just from grade, not mean natural grade. So if there's some concerns about us elevating the site, you take away some of these grading changes in the retaining walls, we're going to be under the required building height, for this particular parcel. So in closing, I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to be part of this project. It's a high profile, very important location. It needs to be great, at a minimum, it needs to be very good. And, I'm very confident that this plan before you tonight is the right thing for this, for this parcel. And, I think it has the opportunity to be great. Thank you.
Thank you. So I will now open it up to public comment. Please come forward, state your name and address, and yes.
Thank you. I'm Stephanie Nikitich, 93 High Street. I live next door to the abandoned gas station. And there is a lot of things I could say about this project, including that I think all of the abutters understood that R3 change would be needed to bring this site back to residential. So I don't think that's ever been a big bone of contention with us. But I'm going to speak tonight in support of 2 written comments to do. One, Jared Eigerman's comment on zoning. And 2, the comment by Novak Nikitich, my husband, on the site plan and engineering aspects of this project. His comment reinforces Jared's recommendations for site plan and peer review under zoning. And while I understand that the ZBA can always ask for peer review, I'm not sure I've ever seen them do it. So it's nice to have a requirement such as I believe there is in the DOD for some things, a requirement for peer review. Both of those written comments came late, and I was concerned that you haven't had time to read them. But the city's development agreement also came late, just yesterday at 3 p.m. And it contains some surprises for abutters, especially that it is not a contingency for rezoning the property to R3. We had understood from the planning office when we spoke to you, Director Ford, that this would be the case. I think there's a big difference in saying it is unlikely something will happen if it's discretionary, and saying it will not happen. And this is so important that if this deal were to fall through, if this project were to fall through, and this were already rezoned to R3, it could become many things besides this unless it's tied to a development agreement like this. So that's our concern. If you change it to R3, this project doesn't happen, and now a new buyer comes along and wants to do something entirely different, and we no longer have these restrictions on what can be done on this particular at this particular corner. And I think Jared's point about spot zoning had more to do with that. So he's the lawyer, I'm not, but I really do think it's important to consider everything he wrote to you I think it's also, difficult for something this important to come in, the development agreement, so late before this hearing, and you might want to consider continuing so that the public and you and all counselors have more of a chance to consider the development agreement relative to, the zoning. In the meantime, I want to thank Scott Brown and his client for the time Scott has spent with the butters discussing the plans. He's been very open to us. We have had very good discussions about this, including just yesterday. And one of the things that we did was go through some additional things that he penciled in on that drawing. But now this is part of a development agreement. So it seems to be hitting the concrete stage pretty quickly. So finally, this is a 100-year opportunity to restore a very prominent corner of High Street to residential use. And we do think that it's, the city should make sure that it is done right. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comments? Yes, come on forward. State your name and address. Two of you. Please state your name and address and go ahead.
My name is Martin Sal. I live at 109 State Street, which is up the other direct abutter. And I do want to thank Scott for consulting with us when he was bringing up plans. It was very helpful to see, you know, instead of me just peeking out the window and saying, what's going on over there? But I am certainly all for putting residential usage on that corner. And I'd also like to thank you for bringing it to the council and to the planning board so quickly. And appreciate you spending time on it. My only, you know, in the last couple days, the only thing that's happened though is I had a couple questions about, again, the idea of a contingency plan. If the plan fell through and it's already zoned R3, what would the result of that be? I tried reading through some of the definitions and what's allowed in different districts. It was Greek to me. I could follow some of it. And so I hope that you guys are wise enough to figure out, to protect that corner and make sure that it goes through, that you can understand the possibility of it not, having this, watching out for the safety of having a good development. I guess that's my only other concern, is the unintended consequences of changing this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Will Barrett from 112 High Street, right across the street. And fantastic presentation on the history of the zoning. Thank you very much for that. And I just have a couple concerns on the setback on the High Street side. That is a very busy intersection. I'm a civil engineer by trade, and so I know that road is not legal width. So, that it's that tight area that, and the site distances, if that building was so close to High Street, that was going to cause more problems. We were listening to, people go down the wrong road all the time and, beeping and honking. And I don't think that's gonna, that building so close is gonna help that situation at all. So I am a little concerned with that, and I am concerned with the double building idea a little bit, you know. The lot size is, you know, a third of a normal lot, and now we're putting two buildings on it instead of just one. So, you know, and when you look at the building compared to the other buildings in the neighborhood, it's a little bit more massive in comparison to the ones nearby. And if you're looking at the setback on High Street, if you go down High Street, all the buildings are really far back. And that one is right tied up against it. So I'm just a little bit concerned about that. That's about it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else who'd like to speak before we close public comment? In that case, we'll close the public comment period and bring it back to the council and planning board. And any discussion, concerns you may have, discussion points, et cetera.
Question. Comment? Yes, so I'm wondering if representative for the developer could talk a little bit more about how invested they are in the project, maybe to allay some of the concerns of the letter. And you know, the likelihood of going through with the project, and start with that. Maybe we could talk a little bit about, you know, what are the restrictions if there were no developer? What kind of peer review authority we have and how that might look? We do that?
Yeah, I want to first question to the
Yeah.
applicant. Yeah.
To attorney.
Well, Scott, you've been working on this how many months?
4 or 5, right?
So Scott's been doing this design 4 or 5 months. I've been working on it for 3 or 4 months because it was before the summer. The developer, who doesn't yet even own the property and only has a purchase and sale agreement, has spent tens of thousands of dollars so far to get to here. He's pretty invested in making this happen. So his goal, and he's continued to work with Global to make sure the PNS is extended along the way to make sure that this development can happen. So I don't know how else to, somebody who doesn't really care is not going to spend the kind of money that he's done, or take the time to let his architect work with the neighbors to come.
Thank you.
So the question for
All right, well, your council president, raise your hand. Council Preston?
Yes, thank you. First, let me apologize for not being there in person tonight. I just circumstances beyond my control. So I had a question about the timeline. So I am feeling some urgency on this, but you know, as Attorney Mead just spoke, you know, they've been working on this for 3 to 4 months for herself, 4 to 5 months on design. The DA was just signed yesterday, and it but I'm also feeling this sense of urgency. Can someone help me understand the timeline to push at the very least this ordinance through?
So the developer's under a purchase and sale agreement, and I can't speak to the exact details of that because I don't represent the developer on the sale or the purchase of it. However, I do know that if the zoning doesn't pass, and he doesn't know that in short order, Global's gonna move forward and do something else. So he needs to know if this is gonna happen and if this is a project he's gonna be able to do on this site. Because if it's not, and the zoning is not gonna pass, he's gonna stop spending money and Global's gonna decide what else they're gonna do. So, I mean, it's a commercial transaction in a hot real estate market with interest rates and construction costs doing all kinds of crazy things. So that's the urgency to know that it's gonna happen.
Thank you. If I may, rather than walking away, but, so I understand that, but at the same token, this obviously, making zoning changes at a very prominent location in the city, in very short order, I do feel a obligation to be certain that we have had ample opportunity for the public to comment. And again, the DA was just signed yesterday, and I'm not sure everyone has really had an opportunity to see that. So I in particular have some hesitancy to move this forward tonight in particular, but can you give me a sense of, what the time frame, what is sort of, and I'm not looking for actual dates, but is there a drop dead on this? And if so, is that December? Is that January? Where does that stand? And let me just note that I do want to see this happen. I want to see this move forward, but I want to make sure that we've had ample opportunity for the residents of Newburyport to weigh in on this. Thank you.
Sure, so the development agreement has the end of January as having the zoning passed. The city council and the planning board have their own processes, so if this doesn't get taken care of in this council cycle, it's gotta be all refiled and renoticed and done all over again in January. Is that not true?
Or in the very least carried over to the next cycle.
Right. So the development agreement does have the end of January, Council Press.
Thank you. That answers my question.
So Andy, I guess the question that Charlie was beginning to get at, with respect to, maybe this is the beginning with respect to the contingency question. Obviously, we could not, the issue is we have a development agreement with a particular developer who's not the owner of the property, et cetera. So there is, so this particular developer at this particular time is bound to essentially substantial compliance with that concept plan if the zoning passes. But I hear from the neighbors that there's concern that that's not a firm contingency. Is it possible to pull out some of those some of the standards in the development agreement and make them a contingency on a zoning amendment?
So I think unless, it wasn't entirely clear from Mr. Agaman's email when he commented on this, I got the email earlier this morning, but whether the suggestion here is that somehow we have something that's recorded and running with the land, as opposed to with the party here. I mean, there are trying to put in where you're making a map change and then saying, this map change, it is an R3 district, we're making a map change here for R3. But we're gonna have very particular requirements for this site that's different than the rest of your R3 district. That would be pretty atypical, I would say. And might in some ways, and then you might have some discussion like, is that spot zoning? But so it's here it's there's a fair amount of detail that's being given up front here that you wouldn't normally have if the zoning was still R3 from before. You'd still see a project like this potentially happening. But you wouldn't have all that detail up front. You'd have all this detail being reviewed essentially before the zoning board of appeals. And in this case, again, just in fairness to what I'm aware of, there's a fair amount of upfront information here that none of us would all have sort of locked down in some way. And again, recognizing that, this will ask what it's gonna do, and the potential buyer has what it's gonna do, but it certainly seems like there's interest in pursuing this piece here as proposed. And I think, as Charlie indicated, the planning board, the zoning board of appeals, both can hire consultants as needed. Should they have any concerns, those hearings can be postponed or continued, I should say, to resolve issues, to take further input from consultants, to digest information. It's not like a variance where there's a very fixed amount of time they have to act on something. If they are unsatisfied that something's been unresolved, they can continue the hearing. They can also reject the application as finding it that it's, detrimental and a problem. So in essence, I'm not myself concerned that the board, whether it's the planning board or the zoning board of appeals, that there is sufficient latitude there, and there could be debate about which board someone wants something to go to or whether it should go to both boards. You know, in some cases, we talk about streamlined permitting, whether that's onerous or something that should have board simultaneously, where they might have differences of opinion and go back and forth, but, you know, it's not apparent to me that there's any less leverage for the zoning board of appeals to review this, or any less ability on their part to get consultants as needed. It's not a particularly large project in the city in the sense that, you know, the whole scale sort of subdivision or site plan review, it's not apparent to me that something substantial would be gained out of doing that process. That could already be achieved essentially through the special permit process, and a greater leverage, I would say, to a discretionary special permit. The ability to say no to a special permit to me is in some ways stronger and preferable than the site plan review process, which assumes that the use is not in question. That it's really just working out some details involved with that. So,
Mr. Chair, if I could just add one other thing. So I forgot, of course, about all the engineering that has gone into this. And so I'm reminded by the developer's representative that he's actually spent over $50,000 already just to get to this point and give the details necessary to do the comparisons of everything around it and the property itself. Their goal is to be in front of the zoning board, if this were passed before December, to be in front of the zoning board in February. Because they want to close and start building this summer. So that's the rush, if you will, is to get it done and get in front of the zoning board. So that gives you better context.
And my question was really not so much about that as trying to explore the response to the questions that have come up.
it's not apparent to me, I guess, how mechanically, what mechanically would we put it, and how, where would we put it and not have it be essentially, I would say, disparate treatment for this parcel versus others in the R3, right?
So that's one of the things I was thinking about. With respect to the neighbor's question, the abutter's question, when we were asked to review this, we were asked to review edits to the zoning. You know, this particular story, right? And so I was thinking this is more accommodative to the city of Newburyport than it is to this particular buyer. And so it just is an opportune time to actually address this so that we can perhaps correct the light that's exists on that particular corner. So that's how I was looking at it, not necessarily as in favor of a particular buyer, but in favor of the site.
I guess a follow-up question, and again, I don't have a strong feeling about this, but the issue that has come up, in a couple of, at least one comment, has been, and again, it's all speculative. The idea that this development might not go through is all speculative, but, the concern about, as you mentioned, retail sales, services, that sort of thing. Is it possible to limit this to residential use?
I mean, we'd have to put something in there, and again, it's that question of, are we talking about within the R3 designation that this, you know, can change over this area, then specifying that how are we specifying that basically only at the corner of High Street and State Street in an R3, you know, that's a very particular sort of restriction. I'll just say, just speaking only for myself, that if this year were about to come through and the R3 were be in place and the zoning board of appeals were to get an application for something, you know, the R3 is in place and someone wants to do something similar here, but it's not the plan we're talking about, I would be very inclined probably to be saying to both them and to the zoning board of appeals that I think this, or something akin to this, is probably what would be appropriate for the site, rather than, and I certainly would not be in favor of, I would be advocating against anything the traffic generating commercial use, retail services or trade use, to me would not be an appropriate use there. Again, I can't speak for our volunteer board, they have to decide, you know, they have their own jurisdiction, rightfully so. But I would not make any decision to approve that, and I would recommend against a use of that type here. And I think for good reason, the board could similarly find that it's not an appropriate use here. Not to say that zoning, like the council hasn't, you know, reasonably considered that as a possible path for someone in the R3 district, even as close proximity to downtown. However, at this location, particularly close to the intersection of High Street and State Street, I would not want to encourage any of those uses, and I would hope that they would listen to both myself and I'm sure the abutters and others. And I feel pretty confident the zoning board of appeals would take that into account in considering whether or not to allow by special permit multifamily residential versus allowing any other use by special permit that might be more commercial in nature, which to me would not be appropriate for this location. So.
Other questions from councilors or planning board members? Jamie?
Yeah, I believe our zoning administrator code enforcement officer had some comments, unless she feels like it's been addressed. She's always enlightening. I'd love to know what she was thinking.
It was largely addressed by Attorney Mead's presentation at the beginning, but to Councilor McCauley's question at the beginning, and have we looked at some of the R3 elsewhere in the city? And the answer is yes, we have. Much of the R3 has lot sizes that are not adequate for new multifamily or some of these other use developments. Like she said, they're 20,000 square feet, 120 feet of frontage. They just don't exist most of the places, and most of the lots are already developed. If someone were to try and use one of these undersized lots, it would not only have to go through a special permit process for whatever the use is, but also the second layer of a special permit for nonconformities. So while I appreciate all of the questions, it is definitely something that the Office of Planning and Development does before we even, work with the people who are bringing these ordinances forward. So I did want to touch on those as a matter of just point of fact. Again, 40% lot coverage. So as we talk about what might be possible on this site, should this, this particular development agreement not happen, I think a lot of limitations still exist within the R3. You've got a maximum, density and things like that. You've got the setbacks. We have a lot of controls in place, but we have the benefit right now of having worked with, having the abutters work with this development agreement. And so that's a benefit. But the point of fact was just the dimensional controls will limit any potential future.
I just want to go back to the earlier discussion about whether aspects of the development agreement could be incorporated into the zoning for this particular site, so that it is protected from, if this deal were to fall through, and you still have that structure in place for future development proposal. It could be an overlay to the zoning, it could, a planned development agreement of some kind, but isn't there a way to incorporate the important language of the development agreement into the zoning change?
That can mechanically be done further. I guess it's a little bit dependent on how complicated do we think things need to be in order to achieve the result we're looking for, right? And how much of a debate do we have to have about does this particular parcel area need special treatment compared to, say, the rest of the R3, in light of what Jennifer had said and what I said and what, Attorney Mead had spoken to. Is that something we need to layer on top of this? And, we could talk about adding stipulations here and then arguing that that's, not a flood zone, but is necessary in this location for, some purpose. And, there could be a conversation about whether or not there's a, attempt to talk to Global about having something recorded that runs with the property, that have a similar nature, right, as opposed to something that's in this particular party. But, I guess I can only speak on it right now. I'm not necessarily convinced that is necessary here, but I understand if there's some desire about that. That is something we certainly could talk about, whether you want to try to incorporate in this map change of the parcel some particulars, and then, those could be, structurally, those could be inserted in there.
Seems like those same concerns would come up if there was a future development proposal. For sure, you'd still want to push it in the same direction. And it seems to me that this site has unusual prominence in the R3 district.
Sure.
And might warrant special consideration.
You, and I don't know if that warrants further discussion on what particulars, is it, fully in the cap, is it, what things are, what are the desired stipulations if we go here that might be not applicable to the rest of the R3 per se?
So, I think you have to be careful about singling out this particular parcel. Because the more you single it out, the more likely it is to be found to be spot zoning if it was ever brought before a court to decide that. I think that frankly, this is spot zoning if we're just talking about this site. The fact that it's the rest of R3 minimizes or diminishes the specific zoning that's going on for this particular project. So I think it's important that we keep the R3 as broad as it can be, and this parcel to fit within the R three. I think the more specific spatial conditions you place on it, you run the risk that a court might find that it is, spot zoning or this specific benefit being placed on this that wouldn't be on any other parcel.
Councilor Comments.
I actually was gonna say exactly what the at-large counselor said. One of the things in our realm of zoning, and tomorrow evening, there's gonna be a discussion as well related to housing and affordable housing and the concept of R3. And the more restrictive or the more, we're talking about specific design elements or like the spot zoning, it's not gonna serve us better as we get the big picture of the city and what R3 really needs, and trying to really hone in on the aspects to do development, but to be mindful of what we can, knowing special permits is a key part of it. So there is that element for hearing from the abutters, for having that process in place. Let's not restrict it anymore. That's my comment. Thank you.
So if I could, Mr. Chair, I have a suggestion that might get people over this hump.
Okay,
So I don't necessarily disagree that you have to be really careful if you're going to single out one parcel to have particular restrictions. And it seems to me that what I'm hearing, the biggest concern is that we don't want retail service or retail sales here, right? So that's one of the, aside from everything we've committed to, I think that in this particular location, it would be a bad idea. And I think most people would agree that in the R3 district on High Street, it would be a bad idea to have retail sales or retail services. And so if you dropped a footnote under this use for any R3 zoning on High Street, that they could not have R3 sales or R3 services, you can accomplish what you need to accomplish without singling out this parcel, but limiting this parcel to not being able to do retail sales or retail services.
I just got it, I would have no exception to that. I think that's very reasonable and logical one from a land use planning perspective, and it doesn't create this huge inconsistency or sort of spot zoning, because I'm speaking only for myself, and I do agree with Councilor Wright's, comments and Councilor Collins' comments on that. That being said, I think it might address one of the concerns like Bob asked about. That's one that I think has a justifiable basis. It's easily understood, I think, and could be more easily inserted in there without having a huge amount of debate about disparity in the R3 district. But just there.
I guess I'm worried about that one because we haven't notified the property owners, the affected property owners that we're gonna be changing their zoning. So I guess I have very little concern about, and I don't have a strong feeling about making any of the changes I've been asking you about. But I don't have any concern at all about spot zoning because first of all, spot zoning at the edge of a zoning district is something that never happens. It's something, if you're moving a parcel from one zoning district to the adjacent zoning district, that's almost could never be considered spot zoning. It's just not what spot zoning is. And also, any restriction you put on it to make it more consistent with the surrounding properties would not be spot zoning. So if you were to, and I'm not advocating for it, I'm just exploring it, but if you put a restriction on this, saying it could only be residential, that would not be spot zoning because you're making it consistent with everything around it. So I would rather not get into that stuff, but I just kind of explore, responses to what we've heard from abutters. I would not want to get into a situation where we're expanding the restrictions that we're talking about
Further
to other properties that haven't been notified properly.
Thank
We're
you.
going to be doing that. Are there any other questions or discussion? Yes, Heather.
I just have a question. What is the actual, now that the lots have merged, what is the actual address? Is this a High Street address or a State
The
Street
two
address?
parcels still have separate addresses right now, the assessor's office. However, for zoning purposes, they're merged, meaning they have to stay together to qualify, to satisfy zoning
But won't
requirements.
this project have one address?
The units will all be given individual addresses once that
Yeah,
But will they be a high street?
That's up
or
to the
State
assessors. That's gonna be we do what the assessors want. Between the assessors and E911, they get together and they say, here's the address, here are the unit numbers.
Yeah,
That's,
it'll eventually have an updated
Right.
set of.
The reason I ask is because to follow Attorney Nate's point, if it was stated that as High Street, this could not be commercial, this was a High Street property, wouldn't it just be easier for everyone to understand? Whereas to her point, if R3 said you cannot be commercial on High Street, but all of a sudden this property had a State Street address, I just didn't know if that was gonna.
Oh, I think what she's referring to is any property that has frontage on.
running on High Street, but I have to say, this is what happens when you make sausage in public, right? So, the chair had a really good point that if you change that, drop that footnote and didn't notify any other property owner, essentially in the R3 on High Street, they would have a claim that there was improper notice for the zoning change. So the chair it's true. I mean, he's accurate on that. I would be concerned about that change.
I have a question about the site itself. Does it have a environmental clean bill of health to construct?
So, there's currently an AUL on it. However, part of the process is for that AUL to
Could
be
you
closed out.
explain what AUL is?
Excuse me, an activity and use limitation. But that, part of that is to be that's gonna be closed out, so that residential use can be used on the property. But there's a deed restriction to follow related to any excavation, which, yeah.
If I may elaborate, and I only because we got some of that information, through Global, but my understanding is that it wasn't so much that they found something that there was any contaminants they were concerned about, so much as they were concerned about future liability. And the reason for prohibiting future basements was not because there was something they discovered like on a phase 2 assessment, they felt that something had to be cleaned up. Was still there, but rather that they just wanted to prevent, I don't know, belt the suspenders of all precautions. They still wanted to maintain the no basements.
Yeah, and my question was really relative to the timing of approval and construction.
Oh, yeah, no.
So
There's
those
not-
things come up at any time, but
There's not anything on there that will prevent that, no.
Yes, Councilor McCollum.
Yeah, so I just kind of have a comment that it's more toward, the council committee as well as anything. I'm unsure how we signed the development agreement with, an entity that doesn't control the property, granted there's a PNS, there's an AUL on it. And we're rushing to adapt zoning to it, to this. I think many of the concerns, expressed today, the zoning on the R3, the zoning amendment to the R3, I think is benign, to a certain degree, and can be the thought. I think a lot of the concerns that are listed really are amendments to the development agreement. And the amendments to the development agreement, are our zoning approval is also contingent upon completion of the purchase and sale, removal of the AUL. All of those types of things that, would, give us the guarantee that if we make this change, that, it's a two-way guarantee. Because right now, the way I read it, it's a one-way guarantee. When we do this, then the developer can make additional steps. And so I'd ask us to consider maybe some amendments that are supportive of the development agreement, yet list out some of the concerns that were noted not only in public comment, but also planning board comment as well about how we hide this a little bit better for our local there.
By the way, yes,
So I assume the development agreement has been reviewed by council, the city council?
Correct, yeah, we sent it over to Karen North, and Murphy has given Lahane, she reviewed it, and approved it as before with some revisions, there were some adjustments or additional language that was added to clarify some areas that she was concerned about referencing, for instance, the fact that it was understood that it was only one appeals review that had to be done after, that was the process, there were other details that were put in there, but she did review it and approve it as before. And that is the version that was brought to the mayor. We did also consult with her and discuss with her whether or not that's something that had to go to the council versus, whether it's actually the mayor to execute that, the contract and bind them. Recognizing that that only works if the zoning change happens and everyone else is on board with that piece of it. But again, that was sufficient to sort of do that piece of it. She did chime in on that.
Any comments, or have we asked any zoning related questions to council in regard to making this change?
We have, I'm not sure if there's a specific area you're asking about, but we did discuss the range of issues involved here with her. There are designation, whether it's spot zoning, we had discussions with her about the range of things. And for the most part, that we're discussing about this particular area. This one, he's fairly up to speed on what's happening here and was involved in discussion with the mechanics and the particulars here for this site.
Council President has their hand up.
Sorry. Council President?
Sorry, I never lowered it from earlier.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so she's familiar with the overall scheme of things, some of the considerations, and, even the other things were raised by some of the councilors and then the planning board, what are the ramifications elsewhere, we want this to that with her as well.
If the chair will allow, as far as the city council's process and timeline goes, we have the ability to vote to move this into the next session. So it doesn't die, as long as everyone supports doing it, which I don't think there'd be any issues with moving this forward to the next session. So that's just a procedural thing on our part where we could pick this up with the new council, provided we vote in favor of doing that. So I think that still keeps us relatively on the timeline that we would need to be on in order to meet the requirements of the development agreement.
That would give you, I think, 2 meetings in January in addition to the rest of this year. So you'd have 4 meetings in total, let's say, between now and then January 31st.
I think that gives us a sufficient time for additional public comment or additional work to be done by the council in regard to the zoning change.
So, do we have 60, do they have 60 days after our close of our hearing, or is it
90.
this 90? Okay, so we could close it tonight, and it would be January 31st deadline. Yeah. Okay. Are there any other questions before we?
Say what you said again.
Oh, I never remember the dates. The council has 90 days from the date that we close our hearing and give them to actually enact the zoning, or we have to reopen the hearing again. And I couldn't remember, if it was 60, I was gonna ask to postpone until our next meeting, so to give it a full time, yeah.
So just for my own clarity, so we've got one more city council meeting in November, and then we've got one in December. Right. So for us to kind of do a first and second reading, miraculously the water's parted and we wanted to kind of do it, it's possible, but that's highly unlikely. We need to wait for the planning board's report or lack thereof, right? I think you don't have to give us a report. I think you have 20 days.
Yeah, we've got a.
Yeah, you got like a month of waiting to do what happens.
So it's better for us to give you a report.
Yeah, and again, I mean, just for my own personal view, and I'm the chair, but that certainly doesn't really give me any more weight than anybody else. There's just been a lot of new information in the last couple of days. The letters are all, there's a lot to consider there, and as well as the development agreement itself.
And apologies on that front, by the way, we certainly would have pushed that out sooner. They were still with Harris having needed to review it, so we're to work out some of the details. We didn't feel there was any condition to send out.
No, it's in some ways this is kind of simple, but in some ways it's complicated, and I think because of the complications, you know, the unintended consequences need to be thought through and, you know, and for me, the whole 6C piece and any connection with that, it would be good to, you know, see in writing if you're able to cover that in the planning board report.
6C connection, you mean the question as to why we're looking at the potential of two buildings, two residential buildings?
Yeah, I mean, is there a relation between what we're doing and 6C, or are they just two different things?
You know, we had discussions about this, and, you know, my preference, you know, in the absence of, there's no necessary reason to do it this way. My preference would have had to have had the planning board do the special permit granting authority, because it's very similar to 6C, and for some of the reasons other people have talked about in terms of familiarity with site plan review and design review and that sort of thing. I guess I was convinced by the planning director that we, you know, for a limited number of cases, and this is something that would be helpful for the city to move quickly on. So I don't think there's a conflict at all between this and 6C. I think we have, by making the amendment, the language amendment that is on the screen right now, that resolved any issue that I had with Thailand, because without that language, there would have been a conflict with 6C, and now I don't think there's a conflict at all. No, in that case,
All right, is that gonna be in your report that you guys write?
can
you include that?
yes. I will, so I guess the best thing, well, let's move to close our public hearing. I would accept a motion to close our public hearing. Yes, is there a second?
A second.
Okay, all in favor? Okay, thank you. So our hearing is closed. We can move on to deliberations on our report.
Sure.
I don't know whether the planning and development committee would like to close your public hearing or leave it open.
I think we'd probably close it with the 90 days would get us, you know, end of January, we'd still be able to do it. That's 2.5 months away. Kind of factor in, have further meetings, not public hearing, but open meetings where certainly we would hear public comment and then try to bring us in for a landing.
I'm sorry, so that would mean you as a committee could meet again to take into account the planning board's report.
Yeah,
report.
yeah.
Right.
So,
We'll close the public
so
hearing.
thinking about timing, there's a lot that's gone on tonight, and I don't think that I can write a report on the fly tonight.
There's no expectation.
So, which would mean that you would not have something in time for your November meeting, because our next meeting is the 6th.
Correct.
So I would like to have a draft report that I could write and have the board review it and discuss it and vote and approve it on the 6th, which would mean that then you would be passing your discussion on to the next council.
Yeah, I think that sounds good.
Okay.
We can make that happen. Move to the next session.
So, thank you. So do you want to vote to close?
Yeah, is there, I know, so Councilor Wright is making a motion to close our portion of the public hearing. Is there a
I
second?
second that.
All those in favor, I think we do a roll call again for a remote. So Councilor Preston,
Yes.
Councilor Wright.
Yes.
Councilor Cameron, yes. So we will close our portion of the joint public hearing, and you're going to deliberate. Well, we can stay and listen to you. We haven't adjourned our meeting, but yeah.
So I guess that's the next question. Do you feel like there's information that you would like to have incorporated in the report? And there's the first piece. And second, do you feel like you're ready to vote on a recommendation that would be incorporated into the report? I could accept a motion one way or the other, or any number of ways on on the proposed zoning amendment.
So for example, a motion to accept as created.
To recommend as created, and then we can discuss that and discuss what we should do in the report.
I made that motion.
And I'm sorry, if I could just ask for clarification, if we're recommending the originally submitted version of the docket and the potentially as amended version this evening that was suggested, if that's what
Made a
you're.
motion for the version as amended.
Okay.
this evening.
Thanks so much.
Got it.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, so we have a motion and second on the floor. Could we talk about what you would like to have in the report? We've already talked about clarifying the relationship to 6C. Anything else I mean, I will draft what seems to make sense from the discussion tonight. If there's anything that particularly you would like to have included in the report before we vote on this. Nothing. You trust me implicitly.
The only question I would have is, there was discussion about simulating R3 and what would happen in other parcels, and I know it was covered as a discussion about, well, there's only so many lots and there are only so much nature that it wouldn't have an impact, but I should think we could reflect it somehow in writing. Maybe with a table or a map or.
So the report speaking to the limited scope of impacts.
I call it a simulation, but it's however you
We could get information from.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, you'll speak to 6C.
Yes.
Right, okay.
This could be a much simpler report than our last one. Okay, if there is no further discussion, yes, Bob.
There are metrics that were discussed here this evening relative to current R3 requirements that are particular to this thing. In terms of lot coverage, open area, lot size. I think somehow all of those need to be acknowledged.
Noting the potential deficiencies that are viable. Yeah, got it. Yeah.
So basically looking at the dimensional standards for high street residential versus R3 as applied to the site.
And others in.
Pardon?
And other sites.
Well, I think this is really for rezoning of this particular parcel. There's nothing else. All those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. Any opposed? Okay, thank you. So we will get I'll bring that back to the board. September 6th meeting, we'll discuss it, then we'll be official. Pass on.
We'll make a motion to close our committee.
A motion to adjourn.
Okay, made by Councilor Wright, Councilor Preston. Second, all those in favor, Councilor Preston,
Yes.
Councilor Wright.
Yeah.
Cameron, yes, so we're adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we've already addressed item 3 on the agenda. We're on to general business now. And item A is a request for the final release of security for the resort at Backyard Farm. And that has also been requested to be continued to the 7th.
Go back to these, we got, both of this and the, 3
Okay, could I have a motion to continue for December 6th?
So moved.
Please.
I'll second it.
Thank you. All in favor? Thank you. Unanimous. Okay, we're up to CPC representative.
I didn't notice while we're getting applications, so now's the time for the candidates on it. We have, don't forget, we have to write our CPC representative through the city council for appointments,
So, I know when I spoke with you, Jen, months ago, you thought that might be something you might be interested in, community preservation, but you probably forgot that discussion.
I did not.
Art, would you still be interested in doing that?
Yes.
Would. And did you also expect to, have somebody else express that?
No.
Wasn't there? Oh, it was you.
I'm willing to defer to Jen.
Well, you're willing, we don't need to vote, on this is something we.
No, that's quite right. I'll communicate with the mayor's office, we'll get somebody to the council to make sure that appointment, you'll have to do, unfortunately, what might happen is the city council might have a committee meeting in which you're asked to come in and, even though you've already been appointed to this board,
Sure.
you know, it's a little silly in my view, because you're already appointed to one board, but you have to be appointed also to that board. So effectively, the good thing about this timing here is that we could cycle you in such that you're able to look at the applications that are gonna be looked at by the CPC early next year, because the applications are due in December. So effectively, we're pushing about, going to January and doing a review early in the year, earlier than we used to do. So it's great time if you can do it, to jump right in there and go over the numbers that we're dealing with, right? So. They only had, it's really only like 3 heavy meetings in the spring, basically, for this, and after that, the rest of the year is just like, there's not much we have to really do, so that's great, thank you.
Okay, item 4C, approval of minutes. I did not have an opportunity to review these, became in second.
Yeah.
So defer this to our next meeting. Although I did notice it, Bob.
I was on it.
Okay, discussion on story.
On that note, if you don't mind, Rick, so we review these minutes
Yes.
from the last meeting. We're supposed to provide any edits, clarifications.
Yeah, I did just.
I don't think I ever really truly, I thought you were doing it.
Yeah, Liza.
He does do it.
I do, yeah.
Or Bob.
Yeah.
So all of us.
If you feel, yeah, you can go through, you don't have to spend a lot of detail on it, but just go through it. and see.
Grammar.
So, it just send the record to Caitlin.
Okay.
Okay, discussion, Story Avenue rezoning and MBTA communities.
I don't know if I have any more off of that, other than that, Kayla and I did have a discussion, I think it was yesterday, with, MHP, Massachusetts Housing Partnership, about, and I'll be circling back to MVPC, Ian, I think, and MVPC about this, but just, a little follow-up on something called the economic feasibility analysis, that the state expects to essentially justify why we think, a 25% affordability requirement in our 40R district is a reasonable thing to maintain, essentially, while trying to comply with their MBTA communities, zoning requirements, which is a new layer. It's a different set of standards in some state. So, it requires us to basically, it's a little bit, I think we have to have a little bit further discussion with the former Department of Housing and Community Development, which has been renamed, unfortunately, to Executive Office of Housing and Living Communities. For some reason, they had to change it. We'll be discussing with them the quote necessity of having a consultant report that we're spending, tens of thousands of dollars on, to justify why essentially Minco has been able to do 25% affordability in the projects, and we want to maintain that potentially here or elsewhere, while satisfying MBTA communities, as opposed to being forced to bring our threshold down to 10% only in the district, which is not as profitable for the city, I would say, for various reasons we go into, but that's not as good for us, I think, as maintaining the 25% threshold we have. I would want to maintain that, so it comes down to potentially spending some money or working with in-kind assistance, through both the regional planning agency, but more importantly, Mass Housing. We talked with them about a couple of consultants they have available to assist with that, and some other communities who are, getting underway with things. So, other than mentioning the fact that that's important here potentially for us, because we want to maintain that, not lose it. I don't think I have anything else to add at this point.
You wouldn't lose it as long as we weren't touching that district.
Well, that's right. So that's part of my concern is just making sure that both with respect to the existing district, more importantly, other areas outside of that, if we're touching anything else. If we try to have outside our existing 40R district, the 25% requirement, the basically the state has said you can't do that. And what we need to do is ask for something higher. I would note though that even with that, and you can tell me if you disagree, but I think their guidelines make it pretty clear that even if we were to try to do something outside the 40R district and not utilize that, but to say do a so 20-something percent somewhere else, we can only go up to 20%. We can't actually go outside that up to 25. They don't, even if you make an argument to go up from 10%, you can only go up to 20. You can't go up to 25. So, it's like Rick said, and we want to maintain the 25% we have in our district, the 40-yard district, and the benefits we get out of that. But we, in going higher potentially elsewhere than just a floor of 10%, which doesn't really get us any gain for our subsidized housing inventory, it really just makes even for any developer who's coming in for their project. They're only giving us the bare minimum 10% for their own project, so they're making even on their end, not making it any worse, but they're not really helping us with their overall housing inventory. So ideally, we want to go higher than that, and 25% is what we got. Is the biggest bang for our buck in our 40-yard district so far.
So if we couldn't, if we were stuck at 10%.
Yeah.
That would be for as of right projects.
Right.
But we would be able to craft our zoning so that we could give a density bonus for somebody who went to 25%.
Yes.
So
Right,
that,
because their choice to come in and
the
out.
choice to come in, so we could,
Right.
so that would, if we gave enough, if we set our cap for the MBTA communities at the cap that we have to set it at.
And then give a density
And
bonus.
then give a substantial enough density bonus to make it worthwhile for them to go 25%.
And then I think, of course, the drawing the boundary of the district, and it becomes then, are we, what do we get? Like, is it the right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Right.
it becomes more complicated.
Yeah.
Is the Minko project on Route 1, Haley's, is that included with your calculations already? Is it embedded or is it's in addition?
It's part of our base, really.
It's part of our 40-yard base. I mean, the state is looking at just area you've zoned to comply. The important part about Minko's project and the 40-yard district thus far is that because they're all 25%, it's counting towards our subsidized housing inventory in a much better way, far better way than if we had done just 20%. We get credit for all 100% of the units in the building on our subsidized housing inventory. If we got anywhere else based on this MBTA stuff, anywhere else we zone to qualify for MBTA communities, we'll never get that 100% that we've gotten out of the 40-yard district thus far. We did that very consciously years ago, and we got the biggest bang for our buck with the subsidized housing inventory thus far. And it's unfortunate that we're basically told we can't do that to say, set the MBTA communities. It's one reason why I would not want us to lose that here.
What's the AMI threshold? Because you can also qualify all rental units towards the inventory if it's 20% and 50% AMI.
They have their MBTA community stuff is at 80%.
So they're at 80%, so you couldn't even do 50%? No, it's hard to do, and not many developers want to do it, but I'm just wondering if it's.
Yeah, I mean, they basically use the standard 80%.
I mean, you probably could give that as an alternative, but.
You can like a density bonus.
Because you can do, because that would qualify the whole project.
I mean, you can give somebody the option if they want to do it and say that's a bonus, but for the baseline, we can't mandate the 50%. Like you can mandate 60% AMI, you couldn't do that because to qualify, you have to do just the 80%. It's a convoluted set of state.
So it's a housing production program. It's not an affordable housing.
Yeah, that's exactly. It's a housing market saturation program, not a affordable housing production program. So the idea is that they just create enough units, regardless of whether they're deed restricted in any way, shape, or form, that they then bring down the prices because there's so much competition, because there's so many units. We'll see whether that pans out to be true or not, and or if it becomes true at Newburyport, but that's the assumption they've had. Yeah, is that they just saturate the market with as many units that are as of right.
And not that I disagree with, it's also a ridership production program.
It is. It's a 2-for-1 by the state, right? Yeah.
What is the status of consultant selection for Story Avenue?
Just getting, like I said, Julia, they're just getting going on that. Yeah.
And timelines, you have a sense of?
I would like to, by the year end, close the loop on that, so we can really get them going.
Are you thinking of 2 separate consultants? The infrastructure and one for the.
Well, the infrastructure piece, I still have to discuss with the public services and the administration, but I really feel like that should be just a tag on to the consultants that we already work with, because they're already familiar with our infrastructure, our systems. It seems almost silly to bring in another consultant. They actually already have 3 consultants who work on water related issues, which is exciting to me. But that being the case, I certainly don't think we need any more, and they have to be familiarize themselves with everything. So I'd rather start with the one who's already familiar with our calculations of, gallons per day, drawdown, we're allowed to do, or might be able to do just what physical capacity, and then work with that. So on that front, however, the two consultants I'm more particularly interested in, actually, I'm, in some ways more interested in the visualization consultants, assistants than I am in the zoning portion consultant. I realize that I sound confusing, but mainly because I feel like we could have our discussion about what we think needs to be tweaked about, say, using a 40R template. We have a lot of comps that, from the 40R district, the story out of the area. The questions that become, if we're gonna use the same framework, what changes? We work with that. So I'm actually less concerned in some ways about the consultant being assisting us with that piece than I am about visualizing for the community, so we don't get, a whole bunch of slowing down. People really understand the benefits of the changes we're making. They can see what that looks like. I think that really helps us here. We haven't really put, in recent years, when we talked about zoning, like when we did the 40R district, the previous work, prior to my time here for the 40R area, for the transfer development rights kind of thing, and all that, but they did some visualization then, some, sketches and things like that, but there was nothing done with the recent 40R, there was no funds that were appropriated to that. So, it would be great to have something to help, set the stage. And I mean, for instance, I keep, like, you look at the intersection with, Low Street and Story Avenue, and you see the institution there. I mean, CVS is kind of contributes a little bit to that, but only partially because the drive-through there. So, but the institution is a good sort of landmark example to say, look, this is kind of representative of what this corner should look like, and, the area, the buildings up against the street, it's a decent architectural design. That's the kind of setting the stage there. That's not residential, but I think that what we want to do is kind of give somebody a before and after visual of a couple of vantage points and maybe an overall scheme and say, this is what it would look like. It's not going to be the final plan, but this is what it would look like. I really feel like that's going to be very helpful to us here. Not to say that we don't need some more assistance on the zoning end of it, but I think that's actually in some ways going to be more useful because some of that other ground we can actually cover through our own discussions to some degree. So again, that's just my take. But, so for those of you who have architectural backgrounds, so like those, we've worked with various consultants before, and you've worked with various consultants before, other experience of working with consultants, but ones that would be good to work with us on the sort of, visualization, could be 3D modeling, but at least some sort of comparative renderings. If you have any suggestions, would love to.
Well, that's the kind of thing that you can get interns or BAC student, Boston Architectural College students for. I mean, if it's not this zoning expertise you're looking for, you're just looking for the graphics.
Yeah, I mean, we could give them some direction as to what's needed there. So, I mean, again, if that's a suggestion right there, if there's firm other than the, that end of it, here the assumption is that there's funds available for this grant that we would be paying someone, to do it. But again, whether someone's volunteering or they're doing it through that and they get, paid some money if they're available and have to do it for a better price. I think, I'm not wedded to any particular party for that. I'm more interested in the final result that they would give us. That's something that presents well, that, that gives us visualization that says this is the corner that feels like a Newburyport as they're arriving and doesn't, show us the conversion from a strip mall to, something a little bit closer to what we're seeing now, starting to happen in the 40R district, or with the Story Avenue area. We don't have any visualization for that.
So part of this is confusing to me, and I've been looking more as I'm driving about this rezoning. And I love it. I think it's all very important. It's gonna be beautiful. But the thing that's confusing to me is that once the zoning is allocated to this area that the building should be a certain way, we have to wait until each building transfers ownership or asks to renovate or.
Just like the 40R district, we adopt the zoning, but we're still beholden to the private developers or owners that come in and say, I'm going to develop my site. So, Kmart's vacant, so there's some interest in doing that one more quickly, I'm sure, than other places.
Okay, right.
But the MBTA site, for instance, that was low hanging fruit, there's a parking lot, the state was interested in mobilizing it. Whereas if you look at the other side of the train station, where there's an office park, sort of.
Yeah.
Complex, at some point, someone's gonna say, look, there's a bigger bang for my buck here by that I'll be residential, but it's also a question of, who's got leases, and what's the time frame of that, what's, rates, So, arguably, at some point, someone's gonna say a 5-story building next to the train station, our residential unit is way better than, and that, it's kind of that kind of thing. So we're still dependent on them because we don't, if it was around school.
But like, we could pass this and it could take 15 years for Dunkin' Donuts to say, I wanna do something, or Mobile to say. So it would just be like a slower process of.
That's right.
Okay.
But the state wants us to adopt for MBTA communities at least, it doesn't have to be, Story Avenue doesn't have to be part of our MBTA communities piece, but the state wants us to, or requires us to adopt whatever changes we're doing to satisfy MBTA communities by December of the 31st of next year.
Yeah. Okay, I just want to make sure I understood that, okay.
So you've allocated, in your grant application, you've allocated funding in 3 buckets.
but we can also move that.
You can move it?
Yeah, they're not as worried about that.
So if you were to go to, what I was thinking was to go to an existing consultant for the infrastructure piece, maybe it's gonna be 5,000.
Well, that was exactly my point, it's like, it should not be a heavy lift, because essentially if I give them a map and I say, look, we're thinking about ballpark, let's be conservative, add a little bit to it, this number of units potentially added to the Story Avenue area, and this number of units, aside from our 49 district, this number of units being added based on everyday communities, throw that on the map, putting aside all the infrastructure between, show us that our treatment plants can handle, that flow, that capacity of flow. Recognizing that we also serve two other communities, and that's another thing we gotta consider here, right? We've got these relationships and, contractual relationships, intermunicipal agreements with West Newbury and Newbury, that have to be contemplated too. And any buildup that might be associated with that, but, all this complexity combined, if they can come back and say, look, we can provide the water and the sewage treatment, and we also have buffer, we want to make sure there's, some buffer, for, droughts or, other unexpected contingencies, then we could faithfully then say, not that the state isn't still requiring us to make changes for everyday communities, but they don't, they seem to sort of acknowledge, yeah, we know there might be an issue there, sort that out, but at least we can flag that now if we see something going awry. And I, quite frankly, just as a planner, aside from Newburyport, just as a planner, it's not really sustainable. They keep saying we're just gonna keep adding housing, or, we can't build indefinitely out of our problems, right? There's just a limited amount of resources, land, water, it's, you can't do it indefinitely. And so the idea of just, building out of the saturation of the market and so forth, yeah, that's great for that, maybe if it worked. But we also run into, we just can't provide enough water for it. We can't treat enough water for it, et cetera. So, unfortunately.
Services, schools.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
What capacity?
Yeah.
The school, they're already,
Yeah.
I think maximum.
Yeah, I mean, indefinite growth regardless of whether it's Newburyport is not sustainable actually, and the idea of the term of smart growth is a little bit kind of a contradiction in itself, right? And then you can't grow indefinitely, so.
So is there anything more to talk about on that? So just looking ahead, first of all, tomorrow night, we have the housing forum here at 6 o'clock.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
If anybody's interested in Newburyport.
Sorry, I should have mentioned that, everything else on my mind.
Is that gonna be recorded for people who can't attend?
I don't know.
My understanding is it will not be, Port Media or Hub had checked in on that, I don't think they're going to be able to do that, yeah, so.
So our next meeting, which is December 6th, we have a couple things we postponed, three things we postponed from that, right? We've got the Lower Atkinson Common and Bastrop Farm and the report on the zoning amendment. We also have three applications with a total of, I think, 4 or 5 special permits.
Yeah.
And so I don't know, good for you, those of you who might have conflicts to look and see if you have conflicts, so we know, what the needs are for the associate members.
This is the 6th?
This is the 6th, yeah.
Yeah, especially, I mean, not every board member, the chair is always thinking of this, not every board member always thinks of it, but it sometimes comes in just the question of, do we have enough people for a meeting? But it also becomes relevant, not only for the board, but also sometimes for the applicants, because if there's like just barely enough people to vote in favor of something, they might sometimes say, look, I'll just ask for a continuance, because they'd rather make sure there's at least a buffer, of other members. So that's helpful for us to know in advance, if possible, the chair and the office, because we can plan ahead and try to make sure that things are running smoothly, we're not all just wasting time.
And are we allowed, in that, say, the issue with that, are we allowed to attend via Zoom?
We don't have to attend here, you can attend here. You mean
For the vote?
Oh, yeah.
For whatever reason.
Yeah, as long as, unless like for some reason you missed the prior hearing and you listen to the recording, yeah, you can vote remotely. Okay.
But that actually raises another.
Raises another,
Which we talked about, which is that, there's been some concern about remote participation by others than planning board members. The planning board members, I think, is perfectly reasonable to, if you can't be here, to attend remotely. On an unusual situation, if you're on vacation in Japan or something.
Do that.
But we've been talking about possibly limiting other people participating remotely. We've had some real difficult, meetings in the past few months with not being able to hear an engineer working for an applicant and that kind of thing. And so I don't think it's very helpful to have the applicants particularly participating remotely.
I agree.
So,
Yeah, I would add to that, so the zoning board of appeals discussed it last night, actually, and they had talked about basically like January, they wanted to start basically saying, look, as, you know, starting in January, to kind of finish out the year. Starting in January, nobody is doing anything remote other than listening into the meeting. I actually want to circle back with them because Rick and I had a conversation, I think that where Rick and I think came out with one that's probably preferable, which is, they went so far as to say like, no, we don't even think, like our own board members or, you know, like they hadn't contemplated, for instance, like what if our legal counsel can't be here, but we want them to participate, they can only participate remotely. Are we really gonna preclude them from, like, is that really in our best interest to include them? So, well, we might think it's bad to have, well, remote public comment, and we make that clear to the public that they want to comment, they have to come here. That's a, you know, it's a policy choice you make. Partly based on still having adequate equipment and all that kind of stuff, they want to do that, but it might kind of alleviate some pressures. But I also would think if we're going to maintain any kind of remote piece, we probably want to at least maintain ability for board members if necessary. Again, I'll refer to you as chair and the board members, but I would want to maintain flexibility for the board members, for legal counsel, for the city's officials, you know, they might be able to participate. To me, that would be silly to preclude ourselves from doing it. I recognize why things like Zoom bombing or applicants presenting and not being able to hear things coherently and all that is an issue, and I might want to draw a line with that, but I would be concerned about taking away flexibility that you have for yourself and other city officials that might be beneficial to this process, so.
You have the continuity burden of a hearing, right? You have to participate in every hearing.
Exactly, it makes it that much harder.
You could drop out when it's lengthy.
Yeah.
okay, so that takes care of the sixth. The sixth is gonna be a full meeting. Very
Yeah.
likely.
So then with the, because we, previously we had contemplated whether or not the Atkinson piece should be continued to the 20th.
Right,
Yeah.
so that's a good question. So have you talked to Kim about that?
Well, we had not, Caitlin had reached out to her, we had a conversation and we weren't able to get an answer back from her. When I was leaving, today was when I was closing out the conversation with Caitlin today, she was gonna relay to her, look, it's probably something in your best interest anyway, because you're gonna be sitting there probably till the end of the night, to where we're gonna pick it up. So we weren't able to close it out completely. I don't frankly think it's gonna make a whole lot of difference to them. So if you know, frankly, if that went to the 20th, I don't think that's necessarily a big deal. But
Yeah, so the other thing that's going on, just thinking ahead toward meetings, our first January meeting would be on January 3rd.
right,
And so, we're trying to think about whether we can cancel that meeting. So we'll make that decision on the 6th, based on whether any new applications have come in that really seem time pressing. You know, if somebody comes in with an application that doesn't have a lot of pressure, the staff can talk to the applicant, push them off to the 17th or whatever it is. Because it'd be nice not to have to do it right after New Year's. But we also have to think about what we're gonna do about talking about kind of a zoning workshop at some point.
correct.
We talked about doing that in January. I'm just not sure. I think we can talk about that on the 6th also.
Yeah, I think we talked before, you and I should talk about Roy, and we should touch base on the 6th.
Yeah. So on the 6th, we're gonna be definitely doing, unless there are requests for postponements, 3 special permits. Three applications with special permits on it, has 3 or 4 special permits as part of it, or site plan review as well. And then maybe we can convince Kim to move to the 20th. We definitely have to do the vote on our report for zoning that we discussed tonight. And probably Bashar Farms can be a quick one, right?
Yeah, I would think so at this point, assuming that it's in order, it should be pretty quick, because Bill would have been able to close the loop at that point, and once he does, I would think it's a formality here. We haven't brought it to you and said it's ready, and that's they've asked for continuance because they haven't satisfied Bill yet, and we said, you're not ready yet, so. I guess I think we're going to the assumption right now that the 20th isn't an issue for folks in December generally, we have enough people for the meeting planned, right, so. I think if it makes sense for us to just relay to Kim now, then it probably makes sense to just do that one.
I would suggest.
Because that way you don't have pressure that night to do so much on one night. Okay.
And also, we don't have the requirement for Tuesdays. Right?
Correct.
It's a special site plan review.
Yeah.
So, So half of us can take holidays early.
So regarding the attendance for the sixth, do you think there's gonna be a similar question about attendance on the 20th? Like if any of these get postponed from the sixth to 20th, because I know I won't be here the 20th. Is that, or be hard for me to be here on the 20th,
What are the applications that we have?
but I can be here the sixth.
One of them is the pickleball.
Yeah, 350 high, 4 new pasture, 124 high. Oh, wait a minute, that was a banana,
That was there this afternoon.
I was so busy there with other stuff, and my staff had told me there's another thing that came in, so
Oh my
yeah,
goodness.
yeah.
I have
So,
to recuse myself on September.
okay. That's an easy one because it's not a,
Yeah, it's.
Yeah, that's weird, yeah, that's,
so 4 new pasture is the brewery.
correct, yeah.
That's just to get a pickleball court, right?
Yeah, that's great.
And 350 high and 124 high are additions, right, to existing houses. Or one of them is a conversion of one of them is creating a new unit, turning a
Yeah,
single
one's a 60,
right,
one's
yes.
a 60, yeah.
So maybe that's 350 high. Okay,
Yeah, 60 is the 350 high.
I think we can, I don't think they're gonna be tremendously complicated.
I don't think so, no.
Any other questions or anything you'd like to bring up for discussion?
Oh, sorry, one thing I'll just note, prevent that thing. Citizen Planner Training Collaborative, they do trainings periodically, various members have been, gone to these things over the years, they're usually held in other towns, and so the question is, do you drive there, we pay basically it's about $20 a piece, person to go to these things, and it gives you some training, a bunch of things, it could be the topic of the night, could be your roles and responsibilities of the planning board, and board of appeals members, site plan review, subdivision review, things like that. So they have specific topics, there's I sent something out, basically, letting you know when, some of these things are available, we had a conversation with the administration about just because we, some of the funds that we used to have are no longer available to our department, so it's not as easy for us to do some stuff, so utilizing one of their accounts to make sure we can train some of our board members if you are interested in doing it. The other thing I talked about, I'm interested in doing is having them come to, say, City Hall or Senior Center and doing something specifically for us and picking a topic. So I can circle back with you on this and certainly we'll talk a bit more about this, but the question of which session or topic that they typically do would be beneficial, one or two. I was thinking like 1 or 2 in the coming months, have more activities. They come here, they do a presentation for us, anybody who's able to, it just becomes easier for you because it's right here in the city. And we say, spend a couple $100, but they come and do a presentation that's, for us. And so if you have thoughts on what you're interested in, we can talk about it, but,
I think there's like one, there's roles and responsibilities of planning boards.
yeah.
And one is writing defensible zoning
Exactly, right.
decisions.
Like that's a good one right there, you help out with that stuff, but for you to understand the kind of stuff we're looking, that, it's stuff like that. So if you have any preferences, let us know. Otherwise, we might come back and say, look, this is what we'd like to do, or this is the one that's available coming up, we're interested in doing it.
So is there a schedule out right now for them?
Yeah, they rerolled them essentially, so they had like some fall ones, they are rolling them with a new set, so, but I actually, in some ways, I'm actually more interested in seeing if they can do one here for us. And picking a topic or 2 topics that are good for us, in the coming months, and just having them come and do it, because I think we'll get more people to attend. Typically, we've only got like 1 or 2 people from North going, and I'd rather have something here where almost everybody's, able to at least, get the close proximity or convenient, so.
Yeah, I think site plan review would be a good.
Site plan review?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
I think Judy Barrett.
Yeah.
Okay, something else, I would accept a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
I'll second it.
Other seconds, all in favor?
Okay.
Thank you all.
Thank you.